Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and what if we rethought some of the basic elements of Diablo-like games? What would it take to truly revolutionize the aRPG, rather than just continue to perfect the existing formula? These are the questions that Moon Studios, the developers of Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, sought to answer when they first began work on what would become No Rest for the Wicked, an upcoming aRPG set to hit early access on April 18th. You see, years ago, Thomas Mahler, co-founder of Moon Studios and formerly a member of Blizzard Entertainment, reached out to me. He wanted my thoughts on the prototype of an aRPG they were working on, and I've had to keep that under wraps until now. Now, years later, they flew me out to Vienna to try out the game in their office and share it with you folks in a video series. I also got to sit down with the studio co-founders for an interview. In this video, you'll see one of my playthroughs of the first part of No Rest for the Wicked, and hear me pick Thomas Mahler's brain about the game and the aRPG genre. Our next video will be my interview with both co-founders, where we explore more topics. We're going to thank Moon Studios and Private Division for sponsoring this series, and now we'll dive into my talk with Thomas and just how No Rest for the Wicked will be different from any other aRPG you've played. Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and I'm sitting here with Thomas Mahler, co-founder of Moon Studios, to talk about No Rest for the Wicked, and you folks are looking to revolutionize the aRPG genre, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we basically, when we started No Rest for the Wicked, we looked at all the aRPGs out there, right? And there was this whole, how can we contribute to the genre after we did something similar with Ori, right? Like when we started on Ori, Metroidvanias were not that big of a thing anymore, right? And then I think that's kind of like just became our thing, right? Like we just wanted to see, well, you know, we grew up with playing Diablo, and then it was this whole Diablo 3 came out, and, you know, we were like, is that really what we wanted to do? Like even when we played Diablo 2, we had all these dreams and ideas of like where the genre would be heading. And that was not quite fulfilled in that time, right? So we were like, well, screw it, now we'll do it. And so we looked at every single component that makes up an aRPG, right? And we were like, let's change that game, right? Like even for starting from combat to how the world building should work, right? How level design should work in those kind of games. And we did our own twist, and we'll have to see kind of like if people like that recipe that we cooked up, but yeah, that's the idea.
You've spoken about the risk in doing this,
yeah,
and shaking up something that has been relatively stagnant for so long.
Sure.
What made you take that leap? What gave you the courage?
Well, I mean, we are a small studio, right? I think the problem that you see a lot of times is with the larger studios is that why take that risk, right? Like, they have a formula that works. I rock that boat, right? And we are a small studio, and we're like, you know, our thing, if we want to win big, is that we need to come up with the thing that is kind of like the next big step. And the only way you get to the next big step is if you are okay with taking those risks, right? If we would go out and just do another Diablo clone or something, I don't think people would care that much. So we really have no other choice, right? We need to make sure that we work on stuff that is different and that adds a new twist to it and find our own niche in that. And I think if you want to take that next step, you need to take that risk. Otherwise, you're never going to get there.
And one of those core assertions, those core foundations that you're challenging is combat. And we've spoken about how modern aRPGs basically devolve into tons of explosions on screen, slaughtering hordes of enemies all at once, which has some appeal. Some people like that immense power fantasy. So what approach are you taking, and why do you feel that's the way forward?
Well, again, we very much analyzed the aRPG again before we started on Wicked. We looked at, you know, like what is the history of that, right? Like we looked at, well, in Diablo 1, right? Dave Brevik wanted to do, you know, a turn-based thing, right? And then Blizzard kind of like convinced him, no, make it real time, right? And he did this thing where it's like, well, okay, you have to click, you know, you point and click, and then your character does something. And then there was this natural evolution, right? Like, okay, now let's make it faster, right? Like, let's do more actions. Now let's have spells. And it kind of like evolved into tons and tons of explosions on the screen, lots of numbers and so on. And that is not necessarily what I loved when I played Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, right? It wasn't that, for lack of a better term, spammy yet, right? It wasn't just about huge explosions on the screen, tons of damage numbers flying around, right? It was more, I don't want to say slower paced because it's not about the speed of it, right? It was more
methodical,
precise, methodical, tactical. And we also looked at, well, what did the Japanese designers do? Because in many ways, I'm always in awe of what Japanese designers do, right? I'm a huge Nintendo fan and so on. But then you also have to look at what From Software did and how they changed the whole industry with the Soul series and so on. So we took a really close look at the Dark Souls series, at Monster Hunter and so on, and we steered more into, take more inspiration from that side in terms of combat, because we wanted to give players ultimate control. A lot of times, for most of the aRPGs out there, it's true for Diablo, your Path of Exiles, Lost Ark, blah, blah, the depth in the combat doesn't actually come from the combat itself. It comes from the systems, right? It comes from what affixes do I have on my items and so on. But we wanted things like, okay, no, if I pick up a weapon, it shouldn't just be what are the numbers, right? It should be how does my gameplay change? The timing should matter, right? Because like with that sword, that one sword should feel completely different than if I swing a big great hammer. So the timing should matter, the pacing should matter, the spacing between me and the enemy should matter, right? I should be concerned about things like, oh, the enemy sword collider is this long and like I step away, right? And like I should do it in a way where like it misses me by 1 pixel or something, right? And then it's my turn, that kind of thing. So that it doesn't come just like, hey, left mouse button click spam, basically, but it's like more methodical, more tactical. Like you should think about how do I engage with the enemy and so on, and to create this dance almost that we think is much more satisfying than just big explosion.
Another core assertion, which I guess you're sort of touching upon, is what a class is, what a build is. So you have what you call a soft class system, and even how you assemble a build or describe a build is different in Wicked. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, again, right, we looked at how was it done before, right? And like traditionally, again, you had your 3-4 classes or so, and here's your skill tree. But in many ways, a skill tree often means, well, that's what the designer laid out for you, right? The designer has very much said, this is this particular skill that you can have, right? And only if you have this one, you can now have this one. And we did a skill tree on the very first Ori game, right? And we saw the same thing, right? Where it's like, well, okay, people like have 3 paths that they can go down on. But generally what you see is that, well, most players play it the same way then, right? Because you as a designer do say, hey, you can only take one of these 3 choices. So with Wisps, for example, what we did is, well, now you didn't have the skill tree anymore, but you just got these boons basically through playing in the world. So, and you could get it in whatever order and so on. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring to Wicked as well, that the class thing is not just, doesn't necessarily come from, hey, the designers have laid this out for you and you just unlock it, but that it's literally, we give you a bunch of tools and options and it's up to you to decide. You know, maybe you want to play a really weird build that we haven't even thought about. Maybe you want to play a, you know, like you have your typical options like a strength build and a dex build, int build, etc., right? But then maybe you want to craft a crazy strength build with int, where you do these sword combos, right? But then you also teleport behind enemies to backstab them and so on. And that is cool. And I think there's a certain level of vulnerability that you have to be okay with as a designer, right? Because designers generally want to lock things down and then perfect that experience. And in many ways, you have to be okay with, we'll just give you a bunch of tools, right? And we don't know exactly what you'll come up with, because there's so many options with the affixes, with the enchantments, we call them, and all of that stuff. I'm sure there will be builds that are crazy, but that's okay. We have to be like, that's okay. Let's let the players figure it out, right? And we'll tune when we actually have to tune, right? But there's something really interesting about just creating a system and letting the system play itself out instead of trying to always direct the experience.
So when people are going to be talking to their friends about what build they're going with in the game, they're going to be saying, oh, I'm speccing into strength, intelligence, and what weapon as well, because that's going to define what move sets are available. I guess that ties into itemization. We have different classes of items, but none are made obsolete by the other, from white items to blue to purple to your uniques. You want to talk about those different classes?
Yeah, so in terms of the class, right, what we want you to look at is, so we have the soft class system. You start, you're basically butt naked. You're not making a choice at the start, which also often is an issue in RPGs, where it's like, hey, at the very start of the game, they ask you, go make this choice. When I'm like, I haven't even started the game. What the hell? So we want to do this thing, right, where it's like, let's start you butt naked, and then the RNG does its thing, and like you get certain items. If you like this item, keep playing with it for a while, right? Unlock more things for it and see if you like going down that route. But for how class is defined for us, basically is what attributes are you skilling into? Then what weapons are you getting? What enchantments do you usually play with? Do you want to build where, you know, where you play it fairly safe and like when you hit an enemy, you get health back? Or do you even use cursed items like, hey, if I like this weapon that gives me all these boons, but it reduces my health, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, also the rune attacks, right? Like we have these crazy special attacks basically. where you can do normal combos, but then you can also do this crazy somersault attack. And then it'll be, how do I, with the weapons and with the rune attacks that I have available, right? How can I craft a build that is really interesting, right? Maybe I want this one attack that does this crazy dash forward. And maybe I also want a dodge thing, right? To get out of a precarious situation, right? Then maybe I also need a heal and something else. It's that. And then in terms of the rarities, right? Like our big goal was, there is this expectation that you have some trash loot and so on in the game, right? We always kind of like looked more into the direction of like quality instead of quantity. So even a white item shouldn't just immediately be, oh, that's vendor trash. Like we wanted it to be something where it's like, it doesn't have these enchantments, but it's the most customizable thing. So that even in end game, a white item could actually be really good. It could be better than a lot of other items out there, right? Then we have our rare items, the blue ones, right? Where it's just, hey, we give you a lot of positives, right? And it's in many ways, the rare items are kind of like the safe choice in the Rest for the Wicked. Then we have the purples, which are your cursed items, right? Where you get a bunch of really good boons, but then also a really, a trade-off, right? A really bad purple trade-off. And you would have to see, how does that influence my class, right? How do I like playing with that, right? Is that okay for me, right? Like, and really even change the builds, right? Like there's Blake trade-offs like, hey, it takes away the focus system from you. Those kind of things, which I think create these really interesting, okay, so now I'll play a class that can't use specials, but it makes my normal attacks really strong, or like lights my weapon on fire and so on. So it's that, and then we also have uniques. We have literal items where it's like, no, we as designers want to craft that and give you a very specific experience, right? Like we want this thing that's like, hey, we'll whatever, like drain your health, but then with every hit you get health back, right? Or something like that. And we see a lot of depth in that, right? And generally speaking, we also have this approach here of like less is more. We don't want to overwhelm players with, oh, there's a 5% chance that on a Sunday morning I'll deal 20% more damage. It should just be, here's a list of cool boons that you get, right? And I always drive this thing of like, I want it to be immediately intuitive. So instead of me having to sit down with a calculator, like, does the math even check out, right? That it's like, no, I get it, right? Like I look at it, I just glance at it. Obviously, you need to understand our systems a little bit, but then you can just glance at it and go, yeah, that weapon is really good. Or like, yeah, no, that doesn't fit my playstyle. I give that to another player, or I used it for another class. And so that's our approach.
And then there's also crafting.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? Like a lot of people, like I love the RNG aspect, but then it's also always good to have something where it's like, hey, I can target farm, right? Like if somebody shows like a Twitter thing of like, oh my God, look at this weapon, this is really cool. Then there should also be options where I can actually say, like, I can target farm that item and I can actually customize it the way I want, where, we have these gems where it's like, hey, you can socket that in and then that gives you a very specific boon.
This change to this more active, this more engaging skill system, it's going to result in players needing to be more skilled than just the standard click, 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 spamming buttons playstyle. Now, you've previously expressed that there's a fallacy that games need to be very casual to be like big and successful. In what way do you feel that assertion has been challenged by other games, and how do you feel that you guys can reach a nice core audience, even if it's maybe going to be a little bit more challenging than what core aRPG fans are used to?
I think that fallacy actually has never been true. And even in the team, we have some voices where it's like, hey, whenever I tweak a boss and it's brutally difficult, we have some voices in the team where it's like, oh, that will not work for the casual gamers. But if you look at the actual market, Dota is an extremely complex game, right? And at some point, it was the most popular game out there, right? Like League of Legends and so on. But it's not an easy game to get into. And then the Dark Souls games have always been called like extremely difficult. And they sold a certain number of units, right? But then Elden Ring came out, they tweaked the formula a little bit, and suddenly an Elden Ring sells 20 million copies. So I don't think it's true that people aren't into complexity or like that they're turned off by complex systems and so on. Same thing with Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter Worlds just sold over 20 million copies, right? So I think it's just about quality and like, is this a fun experience, right? And not about making it simple. In terms of the whole aRPG crowd, frankly, and to be completely honest, like we don't know, right? Like we just want to contribute to the genre. We want to craft the kind of aRPG that we always wanted to see, where we thought when we were playing games like Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 back then, right? Like I hope this is where the genre will be heading. And I'm sure we will alienate for some folks and so on. We'll make some mistakes. That's okay, because we just want to bring something out where we feel like this is what we always wanted to play. And I always have this feeling of like, hey, as long as we reach that, right? As long as I can play the builds and I feel like this is really fun, I have this confidence that then there should be quite a lot of people out there that also really like this experience. Maybe we're not going to convert all the Diablo people or all the Souls players or something. I think that's fine, right? Like we just need to find our audience, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that just dig it, you know, that really like what we're doing.
In the past, you've expressed that given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of the game, even if they don't realize that they're doing it, and that it's a designer's job to create a package that always stays engaging. Do you want to talk a bit about that? How does a creator go about doing that?
I think the general thing is what we're trying to do with No Rest for the Wicked, right? Is we're trying to kind of like create an experience where you can't just kind of like follow the numbers and so on. Then we don't want to ever give you an experience where, oh, just do this, follow this particular path, and then you're good to go. I think in many ways, like what No Rest for the Wicked does is we don't run these gear checks and so on, and it's a very skill-based game. So that's kind of like the direction that we're heading into.
So theoretically, we could have like naked playthroughs of Wicked.
Yeah. Well, in some way, like we're not doing the Dark Souls thing exactly, right? Where you can do a Souls level 0 run or something like that. But yeah, there will be lots of players, right, who do more with much less, who kill bosses at like, oh, I killed this boss at level 10, right? And in reality, the normal range should be like level 30 or something. And the reason why we did that is because like we still want every point to meta, which is also its own unique thing here.
Now, the topic of multiplayer in aRPGs, you've spoken about in the past how a lot of aRPGs multiplayer modes just kind of feels like it's a single player game and you're kind of have someone along with you. You guys are taking a different approach. I know we're not releasing multiplayer yet, but for the future, what's the different approach you guys are taking there?
Like, again, like we looked at the market, right? We looked at, well, what's actually out there? What are the approaches that have been taken so far? And are we happy with those, right? So what you usually saw in Diablo is that Diablo, again, started as kind of like a single player game. Then they patched in multiplayer towards the end, right? And things just kind of kept going like that, where, you know, usually if you play a session of Diablo, even in multiplayer, right? It's a single player game. A buddy, like, I can host a game. A buddy comes in, joins me, and you know, we can play together for a little bit, and then we go our merry ways. Then you have the Souls games where it's even more stringent, right? Where it's like, hey, so I'm standing in front of a boss battle and I can get a buddy in who helps me, and then after we did the boss together, he gets kicked. And the thing that we all wanted was, but why can't I just keep playing with friends, right? Like I usually with an aRPG or with MMORPGs and all of this stuff, I want to play with a group of friends. I don't necessarily want an experience where we can only play this small portion and then we get kicked. So we approached it in a different way. We created this thing where it's like, you can create your single player realm, but if you decide to share a realm, like let's say you and me play together, right? Like you have your realm, you share it with me, and now I'm a citizen of that realm in the same way that you are, right? I can change the town, Sacrament, as much as you are. I can push progress forward there and so on. And that's what we wanted to see, right? So that we have these cool moments of like, hey, we play together, and we do a dungeon together, but then you need to go away, do your stream, but I'll just keep playing, right? And get my gear and all of this stuff, right? And I know you need a bunch of silver ore or something to craft your new sword that you want. And, you know, I'll go back to Sacrament, I'll drop that stuff into a chest, right? I'll send you a note, hey, Rhykker, I got all this stuff. And the next time you come in, right? Like you see all the changes that I made, all the stuff that I did, what I donated to the town in order to keep upgrading that. So that's the experience that we wanted to create. It's almost like playing a D&D campaign together, that kind of feeling. And, you know, that also comes with some downsides, because like people will have to kind of like communicate with each other, right? Because like people can push progress forward on the realm and, you know, that kind of thing. But it does give you that experience that it's almost a little bit like a Minecraft realm, where it's like that world is alive. It's always there and you can share it together, you know? And that's, I think, is a pretty unique approach.
The Town Hub Sacrament is a progression system of its own, right?
Yeah, that was also something that I always wanted to push, right? So when I, like, that even got back to one of the things that I always heard that Blizzard North regretted not getting into Diablo 2 was the BattleNet towns. People could kind of like share a town together. So that the idea being, you don't just level into your character. That's the only thing that you really care about, right? That's the only progression thing. but that you also have a town. And then, you know, like we built this town together. So even story-wise, Sacrament starts out as this war-torn place, right? A lot of the buildings are destroyed, etc. And then over the course of your journey, we want to make this like, you know, like we want it to feel really satisfying to have like, look how I, you know, upgraded Sacrament and look how fanciful this looks now. And that is the whole goal, that we make the experience of upgrading the town as satisfying as it usually is to just upgrade your character, right? So you have to make these difficult choices of like, hey, I have all these items and these resources. Do I spend them on my character or do I spend them on the town, right? Whereas if I spend them on my character, I can level up my character. If I spend them on the town, right, I could help Fillmore upgrade his smithy so that he can upgrade our weapons and our armors to a higher degree. And you have to make these difficult choices. And that's also for later, or the multiplayer aspect that we'll bring in, that also creates an interesting conundrum, right? Because if you just upgrade your character, you're doing that for you. But then if you upgrade the town, everybody that you're sharing the realm with benefits from that, right? So that will be really interesting, kind of like how people and friendships evolve there.
And you plan to have player housing as well, right?
Yes, so that's also something that I always really loved, the idea of just having a home in your game and being able to customize that. In a lot of games also, what they're doing is that they have the housing on a grid, right? Where it's like, hey, here's a grid and you can put a furniture thing here and then here. And we wanted to do this thing where it's like, well, give players more freedom, right? So that you can really design really, really cool houses. And the houses are also, they serve multiple purposes. So they're for storage, right? So a lot of times you will just want to put chests there, right? And then drop all the loot in there. And even that we made quite fanciful, right? Where it's like, hey, I can craft a really nice cupboard. And the cupboards can hold more consumables than a normal chest can. But in a chest, I can put everything in. So then it's up to the player to decide, well, what am I going for, right? And then also the houses, you typically will put the crafting tables in there, right? Like, so you can have your own anvil there. So if you want to be the blacksmith of your group, that's probably what you will do. You can put refineries there, like a furnace, so you can smelt ore into ingots that you can then upgrade and so on. That's what you'll do there. And then also we'll have just also vanity items, right? To just make it look nice. Lots of people in our team called me crazy, right? When I was basically pitching the idea of like, and people will love making their own little dollhouse, right? But I think RPG players will definitely be the kind of players also who actually enjoy this stuff. Because it's not just about just constantly going out and slaying enemies. Every now and then you also just want to chill. And, you know, now I'll just spend an hour or so just making my house look really cool, right? And then take a screenshot, show it to someone, right? And go, look, my place is really amazing.
And how do you see trade and economy working?
Yeah, so that's a big subject, right? Like I'm constantly debating that with Kevin, our systems designer, right? Like the whole, okay, economy and how should it work, right? Like how much gold do we give to players? How do we make sure that gold actually matters, right? That it's not the typical endgame experience of like, I'm rich, I don't need money for anything. So there's this constant discussion on like what are our money sinks, and trade in general. The way we have it planned right now, the way we're doing it right now is that we don't constrain you to a particular realm, right? So you can also hop between them, and that then allows trading. So if I find, or if somebody finds a really good item on their realm, they could hop onto your realm, and then you can trade those items. And we'll see how it works out, right? Like for now, we are hoping that the gold economy will work. Could be that later on it will be the whole Stone of Jordan kind of, who knows, right? But that's what we're going for right now. There's, like that gold actually matters, right? We'll have to see.
Another thing that you've said on Twitter in the past is, I think it'll be quite difficult to write a walkthrough or a wiki that stays useful for a prolonged period of time. Mm-hmm. What did you mean about that?
I meant that we're constantly changing the game and want to update the game, right? And then a build that is good today doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be good forever, right? And then also just, the changes that we're making, you will have to be really committed to that wiki, I think, because we'll be pretty fast on like updating stuff. We have this whole system called Alive, where every time you revisit an area, right, you don't know what you're going to get, right? And we're going to be pretty quick on like, throwing even more stuff in there, like, hey, here's enemy layouts and so on that you've never played before in this area. And so you'd not constantly need to update it. And that's something that I generally really like. So I grew up playing Zelda on the NES, right? And I grew up with this experience of like, hey, I found some crazy thing in Zelda, right? Like if you put a bomb on this wall, it opens this thing, right? And then you get a torch, and then it does this, and then you share that info in the schoolyard the next day, right? And everybody get excited, right? These days, if you get stuck at anything, just open up YouTube, right? And just quickly look for that. And we want to push against it a little bit because there is something really nice about surprising the player constantly, right? And you not knowing, you know, how the game works, right? And you not knowing exactly everything about the game. For example, with the Souls games, the most exciting time that I always have with Souls games is at the very start, when nobody knows anything, right? And there could be a secret wall behind anything, behind everything and so on. And that's kind of like the direction that we want to push into with all of this.
Another thing you've spoken about in the past is micro gameplay and macro gameplay, and how most people seem to focus on the micro. What exactly is an example of a macro gameplay?
So that's what I mean with the long term, right? So things like Sacrament, our town building stuff, right? Where it's like, hey, so normally in most ARPGs, a lot of ARPGs I'm seeing, right? A lot of it is just slay enemies, get a bunch of XP, right? Like level up as quick as you can and so on, and combat and so on, right? But we also want these macro gameplay things, meaning the long-term investments, right? What am I building towards? You know, it takes some time to build this part of the town. And I do think that's really, really important, right? That people spend as much time on that than they spend on just the micro and their like, what weapon do I have? If done right, I think that could be just as satisfying as investing in your character.
One hot button issue in the genre is loot filters. Do you have any thoughts on loot filters and how that might work in Wicked?
It's a symptom, right? Like you need to actually solve the problem. And we went in this direction of like, when we drop loot, we want the loot to matter, right? We don't constantly want loot pinatas all the time, right? Like we want the loot, even if it's a white thing, right? To have a reason for existence other than just being banned or trash. So I think it needs to be solved on that level, where you don't just put UX stuff there to sort through the trash. No, you need to look at why does that trash constantly happen, right? And like, does that even need to happen? That's our approach.
Another topic that people bring up a lot in some games is map overlays. Some games have it. Diablo 2 had it, for instance, where you have this map overlaid on top of your gameplay while you're playing. Some devs take a stance that, no, this is bad design, but some players still ask for it. Do you have any thoughts and opinions on that?
We are pretty light on that. So I always like it if exploration is literally like, you know, at the start of the game especially, right? Like we do give you map markers where, you know, we have this beautiful hand-drawn map, and then we tell you, hey, in order to get the Sacrament, you need to get from here to there. But we don't do the golden path thing, right? Where it literally, hey, turn your brain off, just follow the path, right? That to me was always brainless, right? And I don't want brainless in Wicked. I want engaging, right? Like I don't want to confuse you with like, hey, you don't know where to go, right? But I want you to have to explore and figure out how to get there by yourself. So even the very first quest that you get in the game, right? Like that you have to reach Sacrament, like we're not telling you exactly where to go. And then later on with other quests, right? We're just telling you in the quest description very specifically, oh, you know, a character talked about there is something behind in this area between the trees, right? And you're like, okay, now I have to figure out what they mean in the quest description, right? Because I think that's also part of that being exciting, right? Like actually asking the player to understand the world, to remember landmarks and so on, and then kind of like puzzle all of that together. So in many ways, it's not like Diablo in that sense, right? Where it's more about learning the world that we built and understanding that, right? And then just getting the level design.
Right, because we have one fixed handcrafted world. There's procedural elements with the enemies and the chests that you can find, but I guess you're almost rewarded for learning the map, learning the layout, knowing where to go to look for these potential spawn points of loot. Like, oh, in this little hidden cavern, sometimes there's a chest that spawns, but sometimes it might be instead the boss that gets you.
That goes to the whole mimic thing and so on, right? Like that's just really fun, right? Like, so the way it works in Wicked, right, is that there was always this unwritten rule for a long time that here's an aRPG, right? An aRPG needs procedurally generated world because otherwise you don't have retention, right? And I always cringed at people making that statement, right? Because first of all, if you have a randomly generated map, we don't have AI yet that can really create interesting level designs, you know, like we just don't. So what happens is, well, if you do randomly generated, you get basically a flat plane, right? And you can be a little bit fanciful about it and suggest that there are hills that I can go up and so on, right? But it's really, it's a map, it's a flat plane. So, and I never really honestly had that feeling of like, oh, it plays completely differently in my next session, right? So let's take Diablo 2, right? I play in Loot Galen, I have a session, right? I have fun. I drop the session, I play again a couple of hours later, right? Does the map now feel completely different? You know, does the level design feel completely different? No, it's just, okay, some paths have changed, you know, like the thing that used to be here is over there now, and that's it. So we approached it from a very different angle. We basically said, we just came from working for a decade on making Metroidvanias, right? And Metroidvanias are all about how do you create a fully interconnected world where retraversing is a thing, right? And if I change something over here as a designer, that could have a big influence on this thing over there, right? On this level over there. Oh my God, we even had something like that on Will of the Wisp, right? Where we changed the order of when you get double jump and dash and so on, and that was a nightmare. But that gave us a lot of experience on like, how do you create a fully interconnected world? Because that's incredibly difficult to do. Yeah, and our thinking was, okay, so after we did that, right, with Ori, how do we take that, like we wanted to take that experience forward into No Rest for the Wicked. We made the decision early on, we're going to handcraft this world. So we're going to make sure there's these, I always call it islands of fun, right? That it's like, hey, yeah, I go through this little area in this zone, where are the enemies placed there, right? Where are the spawns and so on. Let's make sure that is really fun. And so everything gets handcrafted, right? But then how do you solve the retention problem, right? Because it's also not fun if I play the same levels again and again and again, and all the enemy spawns are in the same way and everything, right? So we created this system called Alive, where it's like, let's say I walk through the Mariners Keep, like this old fortress that we have at the start of the game for the first time, right? The very first time you play, we are being specific with the enemy placements and where the loot is and so on, because we need to tutorialize it to you, right? Like we are very specific as designers saying, okay, fight this enemy, now fight this shielded enemy, now fight this ranged enemy, now fight these two enemies at once. And you slowly learn the ropes. But then the cool thing is, after you did this little tutorial section, right, and you reach Sacrament and so on, and you come back, that could be totally different, right? And now we changed, okay, the enemy spawns could be totally different, right? The way the loot drops there could be totally different. You could have different situations there, right? Like I go to the fortress, to the courtyard, and suddenly, oh my God, there's a big boss there or something. Those are the moments that we want to have, and we also want to have these surprise moments, right? Like you saw the whole thing with like, oh, you found a secret under the bridge, right? And then in your next playthrough, I'll go get the secret on the bridge and, oh my God, there's this crazy monster there now, right? Those kind of moments, because that is really fun. We basically want this whole life is like a box of chocolates thing, right? Where it's like, you go into an area, you never know what you're going to get, even though you know the layout. You don't know if in this chimney thing that you first, like where there was a secret area in your previous playthrough, right? Where there was a big special chest there, right? Maybe there's now crazy creatures in there, and you just have to go and explore and find all the stuff.
And is Wicked going to be a game that's like, it releases and then sort of that's it, that's the game? Or is it going to evolve? Is there going to be more content released after release?
For sure. I mean, that was the whole thing that we wanted to do with Wicked, right? Because we come from, on Ori, we made boxed products, right? And that put us always into a bit of a conundrum. First of all, we really liked when the game came out and we saw people playing it, right? And we always cringed a little, like, you know, wouldn't it be cool to have added this feature still or that, We actually did that with Blind Forest. When it first came out, we didn't have fast travel in the game, right? Then we had this whole thing where it's like, hey, Microsoft wanted us to do a Windows 10 version. And we were like, we'll do you one better. We'll create a definitive edition that has all the features that you couldn't get into the first game, in the first release. And so we really like that direction, right? Of like, we'll release it, we give it into players' hands, we look at their feedback, and then let's adjust things to that feedback. So I think that is really exciting for us. And having these boxed products, right? We just had to always, and we always ended up cutting features, right? Because you always get to that point in development where it's like, oh, Jesus Christ, how do we release the game, right? We have all these features, and then you have discussions with the team, right? And you're like, can we cut this feature? And the designers are like, are you crazy? I worked for half a year on this, you know, we're not going to cut it, right? And so this time around, right, we built the game in aRPGs by nature, kind of like very modular, right? Like you can tweak those systems, you can add other things on top. So we did it now in this way, right? Where it's like, well, if a feature isn't ready for release, we're going to hold it back for a bit, and then we're going to release it at a later date, but in a polished way, right? We want to hold things back in a way where we then feel like, okay, this gets released in the best way possible. So generally speaking, I do think we're very excited about that approach of like getting something out there and then listening to the feedback and then iterating on that. And it's also scary. It's scary to a crazy degree, right? Because you make yourself vulnerable as a developer. You put something out and then, you know, you have to see, okay, what is the response, right? And like, what is the reaction? How do we respond to that? And there has to be a little bit of back and forth. I don't mean then we'll do it, you know, designed by committee, that we'll let the community completely design the game, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, we are the designers. We need to know where we're heading with everything. But I do think it's always good. Like, there's lots of smart people out there, right? Like, I'm sure that we'll get lots of feedback, and we want to be able to react to that.
And monetization-wise, what are we looking at?
We decided to go for a very classical model, right, where we'll put the game out there. First of all, we'll be in early access for some time, right? So there's just a flat fee of like being in early access, join us on the journey, but there's no microtransactions or something in there, right? And that's it. And then we'll basically be looking at content updates and expansions. And there you go.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the folks before we end?
I just want to invite everybody to this, right? Like, we've been working on this for years. It's actually really exciting to talk to people like you, right? Like, people that like are really more hardcore aRPG people and so on. And I'd like to invite everybody to that, right? Like, all the people that love Diablo, all the people that love Souls, Zelda and so on, right? Like, we also love these things, right? And we try to make a game that is exactly for, you know, these groups of people. We're trying in many ways always to make these games that we would like to play, right? Where we would feel like, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that some other developer should have done, right? And then, well, somebody didn't do it, so let us do it, and hopefully we'll excite a whole bunch of players.
And that's going to wrap up this video, folks. But stay tuned for my interview coming out next week. And remember, No Rest for the Wicked hits early access on April 18th.